as the person who always knew all the rules of the European Parliament. If ever we needed to ask a question about the rules of the European Parliament, we always went to Richard Corbett, who knew them all backwards. But he was also very knowledgeable about all the other aspects of Europe, and was leader of the Labour MEPs in the European Parliament, and was chosen by Van Rompuy to be an advisor of his when he was appointed President of the European Council, which was an amazingly prestigious and important role, Richard. And then subsequent to that, you've been leader of the MEPs in the Parliament right up till the 31st of January last year, when you were also on the Labour Party NEC, National Executive. And that, I think, is probably one of the big areas we'll want to ask you about, is about the Labour Party in Europe, because, I mean, Keir Starmer made a very important speech, at least was billed as a very important speech this afternoon, and he never actually mentioned Europe at all, as far as we can make out, which seems extraordinary. I mean, Brexit is sort of being submerged as almost a non-thing. So anyway, Richard, have I missed out anything? If your Yorkshire and Humberside is your constituency, I should mention that. Not very far from Scotland, getting close. And we're very glad that you could be with us, and we're very interested to hear what you have to say. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion and chat afterwards.
Yeah. Thank you, John, and thanks.
Okay, carry on.
To all of you for inviting me. And indeed, Keir Starmer's speech today was on a number of matters, but didn't mention Europe. And indeed, one of the points I want to make is that there are people in British politics who think that the Brexit issue is done and it can be ignored and we can move on to other things. And I think there are at least 4 groups of reasons why that is wishful thinking and is not the case. And Brexit is going to continue to dominate politics in Britain over to a significant degree over the coming months and years. The first reason is that Johnson's deal, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, is an incomplete deal. It leaves a number of issues still open, still to be settled, and each one of those issues has potential for considerable controversy and will no doubt feature in heated arguments over the coming period. It hardly does anything for services, for instance. That's 80% of the UK economy. That still has to be settled on a number of fronts, financial services among them, which is of crucial importance for the exchequer in the UK. It does employ a large number of people. It's not just about banks, it's also about insurance services and so on, where at the moment there's an uneasy standoff going on between Britain and the European Union about mutual recognition of equivalence. Now, John Purvis will know much more about this than I do, but that is an issue that is live at this very moment. There is the issue of British participation in the emissions trading scheme. The agreement provides for that we might continue to be part of the European emissions trading scheme, an important tool for applying the Paris Agreement on climate change. Are we going to join with the rest of Europe in cooperating on that or not? That is still open. Still open as well is, and it might surprise you, how much is the UK going to contribute to the EU budget in order to continue to participate in European research programs, which is provided for in the agreement, a rather important area of cooperation, not least on medical research, but you still have to go through some negotiations on that. There is the whole issue of the governance of the agreement, which provides for a joint ministerial, joint council, as it's called, a partnership council, with no fewer than 19 subcommittees under it feeding in proposals to this council, which has the extraordinary power of being able to modify the agreement without needing parliamentary approval. It's absolutely extraordinary feature of the agreement. What kind of parliamentary scrutiny will there be over that at any level for Westminster, for devolved parliaments, or indeed for the joint parliamentary assembly that is envisaged in the agreement? It's not obligatory, but it's possible under the agreement, the joint parliamentary assembly of the European Parliament and the UK to scrutinise the joint council. And within the UK side of that, will it just be Westminster Parliament? Will it involve devolved parliaments? Who will appoint the members of it? Will it just be government appointments? Will the Commons at least be able to elect its own members to it? Or will it be the whips? All this still has to be argued about. And then the deal is incomplete, or at least on insecure foundations, in that one of the main features is dependent on Britain continuing to respect level playing field commitments with the European Union in terms of having access to the European market for British goods, provided that Britain plays by more or less the same standards on fair competition, on consumer protection, on environmental standards, and on workers' rights. If we deviate from that, there are several points in the agreement that would then trigger the possibility of the EU taking reimposing tariffs after a conciliation procedure, which would again be rather controversial. And then the whole review itself is up for review. The whole agreement itself is up for review in 5 years' time, so just after the next general election in the UK. So in all those respects, it is an incomplete deal. So there will be continually issues coming up that will be controversial. The second reason why it's not all done and dusted is that the bits that are settled badly. And we are getting instances of this in the news. You were just mentioning them just before I started. Examples every day of this, from the red tape and bureaucracy facing our exporters, to the threats to supply chains coming into Britain because of the extra paperwork and checks and that the agreement installs. Crucially, the agreement took us out of the European single market, which we didn't have to. We could have stayed in it, essentially like the EEA countries like Norway, and it takes us out of the customs union as well. Now, even with zero tariffs, when you are exporting into a customs union, under WTO rules, you have to have checks on the rules of origin of products to make sure that, for instance, Japan isn't exporting to the EU via Britain to evade tariffs. You have to check that the goods are actually British goods and not Japanese goods, or any other country come to that. And the measure for that is that at least half, or I think it's 55% of the added value has to be added in the UK. Now, that means paperwork and red tape and bureaucracy that didn't exist before for British firms to prove that. And possibly checks at the border to verify that the goods conform with the paperwork. All that is why the agreement can best be described as a trade reduction agreement. It's the only trade deal in history that will actually reduce trade and make it more difficult from what it was before. And we are seeing everyday examples of why that causes problems, not least for anybody exporting or indeed supermarkets importing fresh produce, where holdups make those products, if they're held up unduly, totally unsellable. That's on the economic side, but also on other aspects. Take security. The UK has left all the elements of police cooperation, the shared databases on wanted people or missing people, Europol, the European arrest warrant, all those we have left. That makes it more difficult for law enforcement and even for our border force to check when they need to check, when they feel they need to check somebody coming in. They no longer have real-time access to the police databases in the way that they used to. That affects all kinds of police work, from dealing with abducted children to drug dealers to criminals of all kinds. We've left that. We didn't have to. We could have negotiated a better deal, but this government, with its ideological commitment to not entering into any arrangements that might have to, in the case of dispute, be adjudicated by the European Court of Justice, refused to do that. The deal is bad as well in that it is a gratuitous piece of vandalism, which is removal of the UK from the Erasmus student exchange scheme. Why? It was open for us to continue to participate. Other countries not in the EU do so. The British government, I think because they didn't want British students being exposed to cooperation and the European experience and building ties with our European partners, they are ideologically against that. So they refused to continue even that. And then there are the communities we've frankly shafted. Well, we could say we've shafted the whole country, but think of the Falklands. They export almost all their fish to, which is a vital part of their economy, to the European Union, mostly to Spain. Suddenly, without any special arrangements in place for them in the trade and cooperation agreement, they are facing the hurdles that I mentioned earlier of having to sell their fish into a customs union from outside without any special arrangements. That could destroy the economy of the Falkland Islands. And that brings me on to Northern Ireland as well. An arrangement had to be found once Britain said it was leaving the customs union to decide where you put your customs controls. The land border in Northern Ireland with the Republic, everybody agreed it can't be there. You may remember Theresa May's deal originally kept the whole of the UK within the customs union, supposedly temporarily, but without a deadline to avoid that problem. Johnson came in and changed that. His deal, that's the main point on which it differed with Theresa May's deal, otherwise it was broadly similar, said we'll have a border down the Irish Sea instead and have the customs checks there. Fine, but he denied that that was the case. He said, no, there won't be any checks, there won't be any paperwork, and pretended that that was not what he had done. And of course, as it's now becoming evident that he was lying, a lot of people in Northern Ireland are facing difficulties in terms of trade between GB and Northern Ireland. Now, if he'd been honest from the beginning that that was a choice, maybe that would have been better understood, but he wasn't. So those are just some examples. There are many respects in which this is a bad deal. There are many victims of Brexit, including people who had previously voted to leave, who are now saying, this isn't what was promised. This is completely different from what we expected. So that's the second reason, second group of reasons, if you like, why this issue is not going to fade away. First one was it's an incomplete deal. The second one is that where there is agreement, it's a bad agreement. The third one, it seems to me, is that this government seems intent on annoying the European Union and seeking conflict with the European Union, simply to stoke up its own supporters on this and make sure that it's trying to seek opportunities to portray the EU in a bad light, claim that it's anti-British, and thank goodness we've left, they're so nasty. We've seen it its attempt now to suddenly want to renegotiate the Northern Ireland Protocol, but we've seen it on petty little things like the refusal of the UK to recognise the status of ambassador for the head of the EU's mission to the UK. The EU has diplomatic missions to 145 countries across the world. The head of those missions are always given the status of ambassador. Britain was part of that system. There were many British people exercised the role of being an EU ambassador in various third countries. But now suddenly the UK government is saying, no, you're not a state, so you can't have an ambassador, which is a bit paradoxical when you think that the part of the motivation for the right-wing Eurosceptics for leaving the European Union was that it was too much like a state and we had to keep our sovereignty. Now they're saying, oh, it's not a state at all, so you can't have an ambassador. But more to the point, the key thing is that they are seeking conflict even on petty things like that in order to keep on having conflict with the European Union. So that's a third reason why it won't go away. And the fourth reason, final reason, is that there are many people who simply won't let it rest. I mentioned earlier the victims of Brexit, many of whom had initially supported it in the first place, but also organizations like ours, like yours, the European movements, the various grassroots for Europe groups that exist across the whole of the United Kingdom. In all these cases, there are people who rightly think that Brexit was a mistake, a serious national error, and the very least that needs to be done is repairing some of the damage. And a lot of damage could be repaired within the or attenuated within the context of the deal. Negotiating easier cross-border access for certain goods, a proper a special visa arrangement for performers and artists and pop singers and rock groups, rejoining Erasmus. You could make a long list of things where you could at least attenuate the damage. You wouldn't eliminate it. But there are also many who would say, well, let's go further and argue to rejoin. Now, the main political figures in the Westminster Parliament, at least, are not ready to say that at the moment. That to be able to argue that with force would depend on what happens with public opinion. But I noticed that there's not been much opinion polling over the last few months, but what there has been has shown that a majority of people in the UK think Brexit was a mistake. They are clearly saying that. And they're saying that without any of the nationwide parties, UK-wide parties, having gone out saying that. Without most of the the national UK newspapers having saying that. People are concluding that already. It does sometimes happen that public opinion turns completely against something that is initially supported. Think back to Suez, think back to Iraq. You hardly find anybody nowadays who defends either of those courses of action, but they were initially popular. Public opinion can turn. It's too soon perhaps to know whether it will turn enough to envisage at UK level saying we must rejoin. But I think it certainly is turning enough to say we need to repair the damage, rebuild our relationship with Europe, have a closer relationship. And who knows, it might go further. So that's how I see it. Now, I admit I have been speaking in UK-wide terms. You in Scotland have a particular situation as well on top of that, but I've deliberately not gone into that because in a way that's your debate. But there is, of course, that extra dimension to the debate in Scotland because, of course, you voted overwhelmingly to remain and you have the particular situation and how that interacts with your other debates in Scotland on independence. I'm not going to get into that. That's up to you guys. But of course, the potential breakup of the United Kingdom is not something that traditional conservatives would ever have envisaged Brexit leading to, but the prospect of that is, shall we say, at the very least, an extra argument why the Brexit issue cannot be laid to rest. It will remain a live issue. And if movements such as ours continue to make the case that this was a dreadful mistake, it needs to be rectified at the very least in terms of attenuating the damage and repairing our relationship, and without excluding the possibility of rejoining, then I think we do have the opportunity to do so, to make headway on those arguments. Thank you very much.
I'll mute myself. Richard, that was fantastic and quite mesmerizing, frankly, that you've got it so, I mean, we've all been getting bits of this thing, but you put it so well together. That was really very, very impressive and terrific. I hope this recording gets around a wide audience. I'm sure it will. Can I quickly just ask, what do you make of this thing of Lord Frost being made the Mr. Europe, apparently, and Gove being demoted or whatever? Does that mean anything at all, good or bad or indifferent?
I think it's bad. This is the man who negotiated that deal, which is, as I said, a bad deal. He's very gung-ho on sovereignty trumps everything else, the economy and so on. He will defend that deal to the hilt, probably not seek to improve it at all. And he's been very gung-ho on pointing the finger at Brussels, and whenever he got into trouble in the negotiations, saying it's all their fault, they're being mean and nasty to us. Even on things, take recently the shellfish issue about British sorry, tongue twister, isn't it? Shellfish being exported to the EU, and EU rules say that shellfish coming from outside the EU have to be processed and cleaned and so on before they enter the EU. That's an old EU rule, been there for years. Britain was part of the EU when that rule was elaborated and we agreed it. And now he had the temerity to say, the EU is suddenly being nasty to us because they always accepted our shellfish before without that rule. But of course, I mean, the answer to that is, you know, you guys said Brexit means Brexit. Well, this is a good instance of why Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means you're outside. You're no longer party to those common rules for the common markets, which facilitated trade in that way. So, you know, he's one of the culprits and he's being put in charge.
Right. Who else would like to ask a question or say a point of view? Paul, I think you had some. You got to unmute yourself. Yeah, Paul, let's go ahead.
Yes, that was an excellent summary of the problems that we're facing. One issue that I think is still unresolved is the process of ratification in the EU. Mm-hmm. Is that significant or not? And what are the sort of likely consequences of that to be?
Well, the agreements at the EU's request is only applied provisionally at the moment, pending the EU's ratification, which requires the approval of the European Parliament. And while the UK government rushed the parliamentary procedure through in a single day, in the week between signing the deal and the end of the transition period, the European Union said, no, we insist on there being proper parliamentary scrutiny. So the European Parliament has the time to, every single committee in the European Parliament has been looking at its aspect of the deal and making comments and so on. But the extension, the provisional application was till the end of February. But the EU has found a legal snag in that the agreement to be ratified, and this is important for member states rather than for the European Parliament, needs to be translated into every other language by lawyer linguists, not a rough translation. This is a legal document after all, which applies. And it's a national constitutional requirement in some member states that they must have it in their own language. And that's not yet ready. So the EU has asked the UK to agree in the Joint Ministerial Committee to extend the deadline. And the UK hasn't said yes yet. Now, it may be because they were changing the minister from Gove to Lord Frost, and it's just a technical hold-up. But if the UK is trying to gain leverage with this, I don't see what leverage it could gain, because if it's not ratified, then we're in a no-deal scenario, which is even worse in all kinds of ways. So it looks as though it's just dragging its feet to annoy the EU, frankly. I can't see any other explanation. But I expect they will.
If it isn't ratified by February the 28th, does it fall?
Yes.
Is that the implication?
Yes, it would fall.
If Parliament's not yet ratified it, and all the member states, it could fall on the 28th of February if the member states have not ratified it.
No, if the European Parliament hasn't ratified it, but the alternative is to extend the deadline. I'm sure the UK will. It would be nonsensical not to. But the fact that it's dragging this out is simply a petty way of annoying the EU, it seems to me. I should add that...
taking that...
Pardon?
Carry on.
I should add that the European Parliament, in scrutinising the deal, has zoomed in on a point I mentioned earlier, that the Joint Partnership Council, the UK Minister and the EU Commissioner, has this extraordinary power to amend the deal without parliamentary ratification on either side. And unlike Westminster, the European Parliament is saying, hang on a minute, we want before we vote on this, we want an undertaking that any proposed change first comes to the European Parliament for consideration before the Joint Council of Ministers approves any such modification. And I think that will be conceded to the European Parliament in terms of parliamentary scrutiny, which will be a significant contrast with what happens in Westminster.
In which case it'll be the European Parliament that'll decide whether any further changes can ever take place, as opposed to Westminster. Yeah.
Well, the European Parliament's approval will be a factor, whereas it won't for the UK Parliament.
If I may just come back quickly with the Parliament in mind, how would the European Parliament react to a reapplication from the UK? With horror?
No, I mean, it's not just the European Parliament, but the EU as a whole, really. I mean, certainly the MEPs, when the day we left, all our MEP colleagues were saying, we hope you'll be back soon, we're sure you'll be back one day, etc. We'll miss you. But more seriously, you know, to join the European Union, you need an accession treaty, which needs the approval both of the European Parliament and of the national parliaments of all 27 countries. So it's in one sense a tall order and vulnerable to even individual national requests. You know, Spain might say, yeah, fine, no problem, as soon as you agree to change the status of Gibraltar. Or Greece might say, yeah, fine, no problem, as soon as you return the Parthenon friezes from the British Museum. You never know with such things. So in one sense, it's not it would have been easier to change our minds about Brexit before we left than it is to rejoin procedurally. Nonetheless, from the EU's perspective, losing a member state for the first time in its history is not good. It's economically damaging for them as well, not nearly as much as for us. It causes inconvenience. It diminishes the clout of the European Union in foreign affairs, in trade negotiations worldwide. They feel they've lost something. And after all, the purpose of the EU is to bring the countries of Europe together, not leave one out. So there would be, I think, sympathy, and that's what they all say to me, if Britain were to apply to rejoin, provided it's wholehearted, that at least that there's some sort of guarantee that we don't rejoin and then 2 years later change our minds again. So it would politically, it doesn't legally, but politically it would probably need another referendum that produced a clear majority, and which meant that politically that result was accepted, that in the UK we were not likely to find a significant political party saying, right, let's go through this whole process yet again to have a third decision. So it would depend as well on that, and that depends on us really winning our political arguments one day in the UK.
I think Fiona's had her hand up for a while.
Oh, Fiona, sorry, yes. And Beryl, I think, has too. Fiona first and then Beryl. You keep me informed, because I can't see everybody's thing. Yeah. Okay. Fiona, do you have a question?
Thanks very much, John. Thanks, Richard, for a really nice, succinct summary of all that ailment. I wanted to ask you about this, like the political scene, because across looking at the UK level, the SNP apart, we've basically got one political party that's essentially pro-Brexit and anti-European, and two political parties that seem to be, well, appear to be at best agnostic, or who are not, willing to say a great deal. You kind of hope that below the surface, and then they appear to be, and if that's the case, have they got their tactics and their strategy right? Because otherwise people like us in these groups are really whistling in the wind unless there can be some major party political backing for our stance on Europe.
The Liberals and the Labour Party essentially are the ones sitting on the fence, aren't they? Yeah, what do you see about those two parties, especially the Labour Party, maybe?
Yeah. Well, of course, at the time of the referendum, both those parties were for Remain, although there was a minority of a few MPs and others in the Labour Party, and one Lib Dem MP who campaigned to leave. If you remember, Kate Hoey and Gisela Stewart, especially in the Labour Party. And at that time, we had a leader who campaigns to remain, but with the marked lack of enthusiasm. At the time of the general election, every opposition party in the UK wanted a second referendum, perhaps with some caveats and nuances, but 53% of people voted for parties wanting another referendum. 43% voted for the Conservative Party. But in our non-proportional system, they won a majority of seats on that because their vote was concentrated. Now, it's clear that the initial post-real Brexit, so this, since the 1st of January, reaction of the Liberal Democrats and Labour has been rather cautious, wary of taking up this issue where they think that significant parts of their supporter base would not be very pleased if they took it up, and thinking that people are fed up with Brexit and reopening this whole issue, or being perceived to reopening it as going back to an old argument and we better move on. And perhaps then, once it's settled, rebuild a closer relationship with the European Union. And they're very wary at leadership level of saying anything. I can't really speak much for the Lib Dems, but I know that within the Labour Party, there are a significant number of people who disagree with that view. I think the Labour Party needs to be, and its leadership needs to be much more upfront in drawing attention to the botched Brexit deal, Boris's botched Brexit deal. It's a good line to show up the Conservative government's incompetence and malevolence, and we shouldn't back off from it. And within the Labour Party, there's a couple of organisations, the Labour Movement for Europe, which is officially affiliated to the Labour Party, which has seen a huge growth in its membership recently. There's a number of other grassroots groups, Labour for a European Future, for instance, has done likewise. Another Europe is Possible on the left of the Labour Party, who are beginning to, within the party discussions, make that case more and more strongly. Now, I think that, going back to what I said in my opening remarks, the situation and the constant flow of issues and problems that it will generate will force the hand of the Labour Party leadership to take a more explicit and vociferous viewpoint on this. I hope so. It may need a little bit of encouragement. I'm one of those that's encouraging that direction of movement. But Brexit, after all, has always been an issue that's our relationship with Europe has always been an issue on which there have been differences of view in almost all of our parties.
Thank you. I think that's an interesting point, that actually I think there's an awful lot of potential for the Labour Party to get at the Conservatives, speaking as a Conservative, to get at the Conservatives on what is going wrong and what is bad about what they're doing. I just can't imagine why they're missing those opportunities. But anyway, I've been asked to make sure that if you want to get involved in the discussion, ask a question, put up your hand and Joe will notice it and we'll come to you. So Beryl, you had a question.
Yeah.
Beryl Netherland.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, for that analysis and that really very useful summary of the outcomes and the consequences. It's really pulled quite a lot of all sorts of different things I've been reading together. That was most useful. What I want to ask is about this sort of very nebulous concept, as I see it, of sovereignty. I'm never really sure it's exactly what the Conservatives and other people mean when they talk about it. It's like when politicians talk about sustainability, you feel they don't really know what it means and they can't define it. I can understand that some people might have had the view that we want to make our own laws, but we always had that ability anyway with European law. We transposed that into British legislation. You know, you're always able to adapt things for your local circumstances. So knowing that, what on earth have we gained regarding sovereignty? What is it?
Well, indeed.
Tricky question, sorry.
The new Italian Prime Minister who took office today, Mario Draghi, in his speech to the Italian Parliament, said there is no sovereignty in isolation, which I thought was a rather nice comment. Yeah. But yes, you're right. As a sovereign country, the United Kingdom made its own laws in its own sovereign parliament. However, it agreed as a sovereign parliament that it made sense to make some laws jointly with our neighbouring countries in the European Union. That mostly on things that you can't really sort out by yourselves because they relate to your interdependence. So laws relating to cross-border policing, cross-border trade, cross-border travel. It made sense to have common laws. Not least the common rules for our common market, rules on fair competition, on consumer protection, the labelling of products, environmental standards, and so on. Now, altogether, according to the House of Commons Library, about 12% of laws of legislation in the UK were laws of European Union origin that we had made at EU level. As you said, Beryl, many of those are directives which require transposition into national law through national legislation where you can adjust it to your own circumstances. Others are regulations which apply directly uniformly across the European Union. But together, that only amounted to 12%. And of course, the Eurosceptic mythology that these were laws imposed on us by some alien bureaucracy was always a load of nonsense. European laws are proposed by the European Commission. The European Commission doesn't decide them. To become law, they needed a double approval, double democratic scrutiny. Approval by the directly elected European Parliament, the MPs that everyone across Europe are elected, who are full-time on that, on behalf of their constituents, and approval from the Council, which is composed of ministers from national governments accountable to their own national parliaments. So the idea that this is imposed by an alien bureaucracy, even that small percentage of laws that we do make jointly at European level, was always a bit of Eurosceptic mythology. But unfortunately, it was never that argument was never explained or countered properly in the British debate for years and years.
Yeah.
Well, I think Bill had his hand up as well, did you, Bill?
Thank you.
Excuse me, who's that?
Bill.
Bill.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bill Roger, right.
Just unmuting myself. Thanks, Richard. Fantastic structure to hold an awful lot of information, and really useful to have that. I was interested in your particular point that you made about the likely requirement being placed on the TCA to extend the approval period by the European Parliament, and in particular the likely amendment which would require changes to be ratified by the Parliament as opposed to the officials. It makes for interesting ammunition for those of us who want to compare democracy in Europe.
It wouldn't change the agreement. It would be an undertaking that on the European side, they wouldn't agree within the joint committee to change the agreement without first coming before the European Parliament.
Well, that's answered my question then. That was what I was interested in, because it doesn't reopen the agreement.
No.
Fine.
But it could deny the agreement, could it?
Pardon?
Sorry, I'm just could it deny the agreement if it was brought to them in that circumstance and they said we don't like it, we will not go along with it? If they have that, would that be a veto power of some sort?
Well, if the European Parliament refuses to ratify it, then the deal falls. Now, you can always have a game of who blinks first in this. Would the European Parliament really reject it if it didn't get a sufficiently clear undertaking? Some people say, no, it's not going to do that, but it might. So that's always the case with any parliament when it's faced with ratifying a treaty and threatening not to do so unless it gets a concession. Would it really refuse to ratify it or not? There's always a little bit of give and take there. But in the European context, that usually produces some concessions to the European Parliament.
And if Lord Frost is going to be his nasty self, and everyone's going to antagonize Europe, Mr. Verhofstadt's going to get more and more angry about the way Europe's being portrayed in Britain and the way the government's responding to things. Might that aggravate them enough, do you think, to be quite difficult? What is the atmosphere like? What is the atmosphere like in the Parliament at the moment?
Well, I think most MEPs appreciate there's a difference between what strongly Eurosceptic elements within the government say and what the British people as a whole and Britain as a whole think. I mean, they're all politicians. They know in their own countries you get people on certain wings of political parties or certain extremes saying things. You don't tar the whole country with the brush, of those people any more than you would for other countries. Take the USA. We've all been rolling our eyes at Donald Trump, but that doesn't mean that we think the whole of the USA sort of agrees with him. An alarming number of people do. I accept that, but you know, you don't necessarily say, right, we're never going to have anything to do with them ever again.
John, I think Anthony had his hand up, and then Vanessa.
Anthony. Where's Anthony?
Yeah.
I don't see it.
A wonderful. Am I
Anthony.
audible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, you're okay. Go ahead.
Resume of the problems which we're having with the agreement. From your own intuition about the British political scene, who's gaining by any of this? It seems such a negative move on so many fronts, but it is driven by a very powerful group who are desperate to bring this, wrenching us away from our partners so violently, really. Who is gaining and who is pushing this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it was essentially ideologically driven, with two driving forces that overlap. One is those, they're both on the right wing of the Conservative Party, so maybe John should answer this question.
Well, one or two Labour guys, women, I should say.
Yeah, there's a sort of nationalist, souverainiste, as the French would say, wanting national sovereignty, the independence. They don't like the idea of being tied too strongly to other countries, making joint legislation, etc. You do find such groups in other countries. The Marine Le Pen in France, for instance, don't like the idea of sharing sovereignty even in a limited number of fields. So a sort of nationalist right, some of which has nostalgic views of British history and hark back to the empire and so on. That's been one element. Another has been what I would call a neoliberal right in economic terms. Those who dislike the EU because its single market had rules to protect consumers, the environment, and workers to quite a high standards that in my view could have been better, but were significant enough to make the neoliberal right go apoplectic. All these rules and red tape. We want to compete freely. They wanted a corporate free-for-all, Trump-style economy, unfettered by regulations. Many businesses would tell you that they don't like regulations, but most of them at least acknowledge that having one set of rules across 28 countries was less bureaucratic than having 28 divergent and contradictory sets of rules across a single market. And it helped them even when they had criticisms of the rules. That was better than having 28 sets of conflicting rules. But on the neoliberal right, they don't like rules at all of any standard, and that's why they wanted to leave the EU. And that's also why they didn't want any deal that tied us closely or aligned us closely with European standards.
Yeah. So the next one was who?
Vanessa.
Vanessa.
Thank you, and thank you, Richard, very much for that first-class presentation. My question or comment really follows on very well from that mention of nationalism. I'm just reading Gavin Esler's book about English nationalism, which you may yourself have come across. I would be interested to know how you see that developing from your position in Northern England. How important is that going to continue to be, that feeling that England needs to take back control, not only perhaps from the EU, but also within the UK, and that the Scots and the others are all getting more than they're getting? And linked to that, people have been promised a great sunlit uplands of Brexit, don't seem to be getting it yet. When will their patience run out? Thank you.
Well, on the first point, yeah, English nationalism, I think, has been a feature of this whole episode. For a long time, UKIP was in many ways an English nationalist party. That's perhaps transferred to the Conservative Party, at least part of it, are now English nationalists. The old Conservative and Unionist Party, you don't hear them refer to themselves as Conservative and Unionist Party much nowadays. And the way that the modern, or the Johnson-led Conservative Party treated Northern Ireland, oh yeah, is a problem. Never mind, it's not our problem, is indicative of that. So I think English nationalism has been a feature of this whole episode. As to disappointment that the sunlit uplands have not been forthcoming, I think that's a crucial feature of the current period, and we need to to amplify the voice of disappointed Leave voters. All those people who voted Leave and are now saying that they regret it, or at the very least saying this is not what was promised, this is completely different from what they told us. Those are voices we should be amplifying, because that's in a way much more persuasive than old European enthusiasts like us going out and saying we told you so. It's much more impressive if it's people who had voted to leave, who are saying we were lied to. And I think we need to amplify those voices.
Questions? More? Anybody else on the list, Joe?
Not
But
so
maybe
far,
that-
but maybe I could follow up
Yes.
what you just said there then, because it's something that among all our local groups in Scotland, we've really come to recognise recently that we have to find a way to get our message about how important it is to keep Europe at the top of the agenda and to find ways to keep close to Europe. But we're talking within our bubble, maybe not a silo, because we can probably see out of our bubble and realise that we're not reaching the people that we should be reaching. And it's those people that you've just talked about. And so it seems to me so important that we don't end up in some kind of blame culture, because there are going to be more and more things going wrong as we get to the 1st of April and all the phytosanitary requirements come into force as well. That the blame culture of, well, you all voted for this, needs to be got rid of, and the sort of you need to hold the government to account message needs to get out there. And it's maybe a bit easier in Scotland, but that's really important. It happens all over England as well. And I just wonder if you've had any thoughts about the best way to do that, to amplify, like you said, to amplify these people's voices. How can we do that at a practical level?
Well, I think this is a challenge that all local groups of pro-Europeans are grappling with, and they all want to do it, and that's good. Now, in Yorkshire, where I am, there's a new online newspaper being set up called Yorkshire Bylines.
Oh yeah.
There are equivalent things in different parts of the UK, and they've just put online a thing called the Digby-Jones Index of Job Losses. Why Digby-Jones? Because he famously said there will be no job losses with Brexit. So they're logging every instance they find of job losses. And they've also got a David Davis index of the downsides of Brexit, because David Davis said there wouldn't be any downsides. So they've got another list of all the downsides as they emerge. And I think if all the local groups help collate that, get as much information as possible, try and get it into the media, the local media, the national media, give encouragement to those who are protesting, who are campaigning, amplify the voices of those whose livelihoods have been lost or are under threat, support universities and student groups that are campaigning to rejoin Erasmus. All these things, all this will help create that groundswell of opinion that I referred to earlier.
Thank you. I think Paul and Bill both had questions.
I was going to ask a little bit about the protection of the European citizens that are still with us. And just recently, I read a report saying that there was actually far more European citizens in the United Kingdom than they originally thought, because they have 4.6 million people now registered that are interested in settled status. So they are a huge voice in our country, and obviously such a massive contribution to our country, which has been almost totally ignored by this Vote Leave government. There's a huge opportunity, in a way, if we can harness their rights, etc., as well, because there's such a big part of this which I think have been left behind in a way. Their wishes and their skills should be very much taken into account, and it's almost a national embarrassment, it should be, that we have treated them so badly.
Yeah, and had they been allowed to vote in the referendum, there would have been a different result. And indeed, most Brits living in other EU countries were not able to vote. Whereas by contrast, Commonwealth citizens living in the UK were allowed to vote, even if they came from Rwanda or Mozambique, which had only recently joined the Commonwealth. So it was, well, there's a lot of questions one can ask about that referendum. But the immediate question facing many of the nearly 4 million, and indeed Brits in other European countries, those already there, is their status. And the UK has this system for registering and so on, which is not going to work entirely, because it relies on them finding out, knowing, and then going through the proper registration process by the deadline. And with COVID, self-isolation and so on, there's a significant number who are blissfully unaware of this, despite it. You know, not everybody's following this issue on the news and in the newspapers. Conversely, in Brits in other EU countries, that's usually going all right in terms of registering, because most countries have a system of official residences and identity cards, so you were already logged into their system. So it's just a question of that being acknowledged and registered. But what Brits in other EU countries lose is their rights to onward movement. If you've been living in Luxembourg, say, to then go and move to Brussels in Belgium down the road, no, you've not got the rights to do so that you had as an EU citizen before. And so that's also going to throw up a whole load of issues.
Joe, is that about it? You got your hands up still? No?
Yes, I think Bill has perhaps one last thing to add.
Bill, I was going to ask you, what's European Union going to do to implement all these, to make this happen? Well,
I'm sure you know as well as I do, John. The
European Union incarnate. Well, that's your question too.
But my question to Richard was really around the politics again, going back to the politics, and there was a cynical view, at least I thought it was cynical initially. I've now come to the conclusion that this government it can never be described as being, nothing is too cynical for it to undertake. But the cynical question was asked why the deal was due for renewal after the next UK general election, and the suggested answer was that way Johnson, assuming he was still around, could turn it into yet another election about Europe, the ground on which he feels most familiar, and that he can stoke the fires of xenophobia, let's be honest, around that in order to win a second general election. The thought occurs to me that a smaller scale could also explain why so much of the deal remains to be sorted through in the months and indeed years between now and then. That gives you plenty scope to say, well, of course we wanted this, but these nasty Europeans would not go along with it. So, in other words, following the Trump playbook of these guys are the guys that are stealing our future from us. It's all their fault. And I think it was Joe mentioned the blame culture. So rather than getting away from the blame culture, actually using the blame culture as a political device in order to retain power. Am I completely paranoid?
No, I think that's entirely plausible. Whether he'd really thought it through in advance or not, I don't know. But I certainly think he now has an interest from his viewpoint in continuing to demonize the EU and stoke up conflict with it. Hence, what are the things I mentioned earlier about even petty little things like the status of the EU's ambassador. Is consistently trying to pick fights with the EU to stoke up this idea of them being the enemy, if you like, or the ones we disagree with, and the blame Brussels game is going to go on.
If that's the case, what's then the implications for Labour's position in opposition? Is Labour running scared from being labelled as somehow or other fifth columnists, effectively?
Yeah, I think there are some people in the Labour Party who are a bit wary of that, and that's an internal battle we need to fight.
Good luck.
Thanks. Join the Labour Party, help us.
Yeah. Well, we have the same problem, an even bigger problem in the Conservative Party.
Tell me, John, how many members does the Conservative Party have nowadays? Because if it's only about 50,000, then surely the European Movement's membership could all join and take it over completely.
That's a good point. No, well, we're having a go. We'll get there in the end, I suppose. We'll get there in the end. Well, Richard, I think that we should let you off the hook and go. Maybe if you can stay a little bit longer to hear Larissa Slaney's thing about this is the European citizens in Britain. We're very much conscious of your good point about the British citizens in Europe, and actually that's a very interesting one. That if you're a British citizen registered in Luxembourg, that's your lot.